Right. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're crossing centuries and some truly unforgiving environments. From the choppy, blood-stained waters of 1805 to the sprawling, sun-baked dunes of the Second World War. We are examining two absolutely defining theaters of conflict, the naval clash of Trafalgar and the mechanized desert combat of North Africa. Now, on the surface, ocean waves and desert sands seem, well, literally worlds apart. Yet, as we're going to uncover, the commanders who sought to master them faced remarkably similar, grueling challenges. We're talking distance, maneuver, and the brutal, unforgiving reality of supply.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our agenda for today. We'll start with Masters of Sea and Sand, move into the tactics of audacity, and then explore the tyranny of logistics. After that, we'll look at the turning of the tide, and finally, wrap things up with the ultimate strategic cost.
Section 1. Masters of Sea and Sand.
Let's consider the talismanic British Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. Bold, inspiring, and possessed of an absolutely unyielding spirit. This is a man who stubbornly refused to conceal his bright metals, even when pacing a quarterdeck completely exposed to enemy snipers. Staring down Napoleon's massive combined fleet, he was the very heart and soul of the Royal Navy. Now contrast him with the dynamic desert fox, Erwin Rommel, a dashing German general who arrived in North Africa with strict orders to simply hold the line. Instead, in an act of sheer brazen defiance, he immediately launched a devastating lightning strike against the British Eighth Army. Two vastly different eras, two incredibly audacious men.
Which brings us to Section 2, the tactics of audacity.
Now, what's really interesting here is Nelson's brilliant gamble, famously known as the two columns. You see, standard naval doctrine back in 1805 dictated lining your ships up parallel to the enemy to trade broadsides. Nelson thought this was dreadfully indecisive. Instead, he tossed the rulebook right out the window and drove his fleet in two columns straight at the Franco-Spanish line. Plagued by light winds, Nelson's ships crept forward at a torturous walking pace of just 3 knots. For 45 terrifying minutes, his lead ships just had to absorb withering fire without firing a single shot in return. But upon finally piercing the enemy line, the payoff was absolute. They unleashed devastating, double-shotted broadsides at point-blank range, dragging the enemy into a chaotic close-quarters brawl.
Fast forward to the vast, sweeping expanses of North Africa. Rommel effectively treated the open desert like it was an ocean, a sprawling canvas for maneuver. He utilized what we call combined arms boxes. So instead of those static, rigid frontal charges that the British frequently relied upon, Rommel grouped his panzers, artillery, and engineers into highly mobile, cohesive units. When engaged, these boxes would halt, brilliantly using anti-tank guns to absorb British armor, while his own panzers swept right around the flanks and rear. It was a masterclass in using supreme mobility to utterly dismantle his opponent. Of course, the shifting technological sands heavily dictated the tempo of this war. Early on, the British Matilda II, boasting 78 millimeters of armor, was a sluggish beast, sure, but practically impervious to early Axis guns. But then the arrival of upgun German machines like the Panzer IV-G, and eventually the truly monstrous Tiger tank with its lethal 88 millimeter gun, swung the pendulum right back. Yet technology is nothing without human resolve. Take R.I. Cunningham, a British gunner. In 1942, he was actually ordered to cease fire on an advancing panzer just to save ammunition. He then watched his commander walk 18 meters away, only to be severely wounded by a shell from that very tank. Cunningham later recalled, "I fear I then disobeyed orders and wrecked the tank with just 2 more rounds." Splendid fortitude, wouldn't you say?
Moving on to Section 3, the tyranny of logistics, because tactical genius only gets you so far.
35,000. Just let that number sink in for a moment. It's a staggering figure. In June 1942, Rommel managed to surround and capture Tobruk in just 2 days, taking 35,000 mostly South African defenders prisoner. That's enough to populate a small city. This was the absolute zenith for the Axis in Africa, earning Rommel an instant promotion to Field Marshal by a jubilant Hitler. But here's the catch. This massive victory paradoxically stretched his supply lines to the absolute breaking point. Rommel relentlessly pushed his forces way beyond the brink. His famous dash-to-the-wire maneuver? It failed for one decidedly unromantic reason. His panzers quite literally ran out of petrol. His supply lines were dangerously overextended all the way back to limited ports. And those massive Tiger tanks we just talked about, absolute logistical nightmares. They were guzzling up to 10 liters of fuel per kilometer, bogging down in the mud, and completely draining the very lifeblood of the Officer Corps' mobility.
And you know, this brilliantly illustrates a timeless military truth going all the way back to 1805. Napoleon famously fumed, Villeneuve does not possess the strength of character to command a frigate. French Admiral Villeneuve, commanding the combined fleet, had been absolutely battered by Atlantic gales. Lacking basic supplies and men, Villeneuve pragmatically chose to retreat to Cadiz for repairs rather than pressing on to secure the English Channel. This submission to the tyranny of logistics absolutely infuriated Napoleon, and it effectively sank the emperor's dream of a cross-channel invasion of Britain. The environment won.
Let's move to Section 4, the turning of the tide, and see how this builds to a climax.
As Nelson's fleet bore down at Trafalgar, he sent his immortal signal. England expects that every man will do his duty. What followed was visceral, unmitigated chaos. Trafalgar completely devolved into a close-quarters slugging match. French and Spanish crews repeatedly formed boarding parties, only for British ships to emerge from the thick black smoke, mowing them down with devastating blasts of grapeshot. In the midst of this horrific brawl, a French sniper actually spotted Nelson's bright metals. Struck by a musket ball through the spine, Nelson lived just long enough to know he had secured a decisive victory. His body was famously returned to England, preserved in a cask of brandy. 5,000. That is the solemn weight of the lives lost in the blood-stained waters off Cape Trafalgar in just a matter of hours. A truly staggering human cost. Yet, when the smoke finally cleared, 17 French and Spanish ships had been captured without a single British vessel lost. A total, crushing victory. Over a century later, the British faced a similarly dire do-or-die moment. By 1942, the sheer desperation of the situation was captured perfectly by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who cried out, "Rommel, Rommel, what else matters but beating him?" This immense pressure led the new British commander, General Montgomery, to completely change the paradigm. Blessed with reliable supplies and intercepted intelligence, Montgomery laid a brilliant, heavily dug-in trap at Alam Halfa, completely breaking Rommel's armor. Then, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery used overwhelming artillery to methodically grind the exhausted Axis forces right into the dust. The North African campaign was a sprawling seesaw affair. It went from Rommel's shocking arrival in 1941 to his absolute high-water mark at Tobruk in mid-1942. But following El Alamein and the subsequent American landings in the West, Rommel was crushed in a relentless two-front vice. By 1943, the situation was so decidedly grim that starving, abandoned Axis troops in Tunisia, who were entirely cut off from supplies, literally smashed their weapons against trees and surrendered while singing. It was over.
Finally, Section 5, the ultimate strategic cost.
So the crucial point here is that the strategic outcomes of these battles were absolutely monumental. Trafalgar did not immediately end the Napoleonic Wars, but the sheer scale of the triumph wiped out the French fleet, securing an astonishing 100 years of unchallenged British naval dominance. That was the very bedrock of their 19th century empire. Similarly, victory in North Africa protected the vital Suez Canal and crucially laid bare the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. Defeating Rommel in the desert directly paved the bloody path for the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy. I want to leave you with this rather provocative question to ponder. Looking back at the brilliant, romanticized audacity of Horatio Nelson and Erwin Rommel, is the era of the dashing, maverick commander entirely dead? Have individual brilliance and sheer courage been replaced forever by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of fuel gauges, shipping tonnages, and supply chains? It's a fascinating lens through which to view not just history, but the future of conflict itself. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning what truly turns the tide of history.